Welcome, everyone, to Provocative Conversations. We are so excited and grateful that you listen to us today on Thursdays. You listen to past episodes, and it's because of you that we have listeners from all over the world. And in only, what is it now? This is the 9th episode. So in only 9 weeks, we have almost 400 listeners. I know I am just so excited about that, Dr. Alicia. So thank you to the listeners. Thank you to Dr. Alicia for us being an awesome team together. And I'm just so excited about the impact that we are having in the intelligence and in the lives and the minds of our listeners. So please spread the word, forward our podcast. We really appreciate you helping others to also be informed and provoked.
And you know, Dr. Renee, I had one of our listeners reach out to mention about our last topic. You know, we talked about presidents who have raped.
Oh, that was a very hot topic.
It was. And one listener just wanted gave us another detail to add, which I verified when I looked it up, which is that actually Sally Hemings, who we talked about in relationship to Thomas Jefferson, was the half-sister of Martha Jefferson and came into their possession as a part of Martha Jefferson's dowry. And apparently she was very similar looking to Martha Jefferson as well.
Well, that is good to know, because then if we went back to the other comment of the romanticizing of how she was in Paris and she, chose to leave or chose to stay, then if you're part of a dowry, then that's very informative that from the beginning you were property.
Yes, exactly. So
okay, very good. Thank you to our listeners.
Yeah, and all that romanticizing that they try to put out there is just bullshit. So let's speak the truth about it.
Exactly. Keep it real, Dr. Alicia.
I will, as usual.
There was one when we were talking last time when we were doing the one episode, you're like, go get your baby. That was so funny. And I was like, that's right.
Poor Miss Halpin. I still feel bad for her.
Yes. But it was horrible.
So let's talk about what we're going to do today, Dr. Renee.
Yes. Well, today we are going to talk about how in 2022, can you believe that lynching is still legal? And this is a gross injustice for America, which is supposed to be land of the free and home of the brave, and also for the worldwide icon of having freedom and justice for everyone, which is we are basically being hypocritical and a lie. And I really want us to talk about this today so that we can recognize that in our own communities, despite having a previous Black or African-American president, we are still living in a country that is saying more than what they are doing for justice, and how this lynching is not only legal, but it's just one law that continues to be a representation of other laws and other bills that are either being passed or not being passed. But in essence, they do not support racial justice or any other injustices that are happening. So this is just the beginning of this conversation to provoke everyone to think about what other laws are happening that we don't know about, that are actually egregious acts for our society and for humanity as a whole.
And I wanted to start us out with a quote that is from a Billie Holiday song. Actually, she didn't write the song. Abel Meeropol wrote it in 1939. But if you all can take a listen to that song, it's called Strange Fruit. It is haunting and beautiful. So here's the quote we're going to start out with. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
Very powerful.
So that invokes some pretty strong imagery. And I wanted us to start out with that because it's easy to sort of be sensitized to some of these terms.
That's right.
And so when you hear lynching, it seems like it's something as a part of our past, and definitely it is. But as you said, it's also a part of our present. And we want to work to make sure it's not a part of our future.
That's right.
I just made that all up.
That's right. I was saying that was awesome. Very good. Hashtag go Dr. Alicia.
So what we're going to start out with is I'm just going to do a quick review of what lynching is defined as, some of the historical context of lynching, and then some of our current current stories about people who were brutally killed that in a way that we could consider to be lynching.
Okay.
And then there are some laws today, and I'll just talk about a little bit of that. And after that, we're going to hear from you about like, why in the world does this happen, especially in the modern day?
Okay. And I do want to also talk about the psychology of it as well. So I'm ready.
Yes.
Okay.
So to define lynching, so referring back to that quote that I just said, a lot of people people typically evoke the image of people hanging from the trees because that seems to be a very common practice in terms of how people were lynched. But actually, there were other ways of lynching people they were brutal, torturing, mutilating. Some people were decapitated. Some people were even burned alive. So it's not just about hanging people. It was about brutal murders of people. Now, in terms of what it actually means, it's when somebody is publicly killed, but they have not received any due process. And often these killings occurred with mobs of people. Sometimes law enforcement did participate. I shouldn't say did. I shouldn't speak in past tense because actually this is still what happens.
Right.
And it's all under the idea of some kind of twisted form of justice. So usually there's some kind of accusation, some kind of arrest, and then assembly of a mob, and then the capturing of a person where they then are, again, brutally harmed and murdered. And in the past, they were often publicly done. So, when there was, again, shouldn't say past tense, but when this happened publicly, there would be a crowd of usually white people who were in attendance. And I even read that sometimes there were even photos being sold of this.
Oh, yes, there were. They would even cut off some of the body parts and sell them or just give them away as memorabilia.
Yikes. Yeah, I didn't know all that. So that was like a little surprising to me. And by the way, a lot of this information I got from the NAACP website, which has a really good explanation of lynching and the history and so forth. So we're going to include that link if anybody wants to read what they talked about. So in terms of the history of lynching, it goes back to the late 1800s and obviously, like we're gonna say that we're gonna stop it at 1968. Again, this is according to the NAACP website, but this is just the records that were maintained by the NAACP, and there were 4,743 lynchings that happened in that time period.
Wow.
Yeah,
that we know about.
Yeah, exactly. So those are just the accounts that accounts that they were able to find about it. So like, exactly. It could probably is much, much higher. It's impossible to know how many actually occurred because there was no tracking of it. And so, definitely underreported. So lynching is often thought to be in the South, and for sure, Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, those are the top places where lynchings occurred. Even in the county that I live in here in Florida, we actually have a plaque that talks about where lynchings occurred in our town. So, it's very close to our history, And one thing I found interesting is that, Black people were definitely the primary victims of lynching. They were 72% of the total number that were reported that I mentioned. But actually, a lot of white people were also lynched because they were allies for Black people, and they were anti-lynching people. So that happened. And then there were a lot of immigrants who were also lynched. So people from Mexico, China, and other countries. We see that in present day too, this hate towards Black people, this hate towards immigrants, and also a hate towards allies of those that don't have a voice in our culture. So that was some interesting things I found out about the history of lynching. And then I looked into some current day things that are pretty high profile that people probably have heard of, but I think we could consider current day lynching. So in 1998, James Byrd was killed by white supremacists in Jasper, Texas. And according to the NAACP article, he was actually chained to a car and then he was dragged to his death, which is a horrible and brutal act.
Yeah.
Definitely fits the definition of lynching. And then, in 2020, there were actually a couple of things that happened. So we know about George Floyd, who was, that's definitely a modern day lynching. He was killed in broad daylight. He was held down by his neck for 8 to 9 minutes. And this Derek Chauvin was a Minneapolis police officer who was the one who actually put his
knee.
Yeah, he put his knee on his neck and held him down. And it's between 8 to 9 minutes while, he was the victim, George Floyd, was saying, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I think that's a haunting image that comes to my mind. So that happened in 2020. And then Derek Chauvin, who was the police officer, he was convicted for manslaughter. And then recently, 3 other officers were also convicted for that. But that in that situation, those were actually law enforcement officers who participated in this kind of modern day lynching. And by the way, George Floyd was stopped by the police because a store clerk had accused him of using a counterfeit $20 bill to buy cigarettes.
Yes. I mean, and there were accounts of that store clerk saying, I wish I would have just taken it out of my own paycheck if I did think it was false. But I went and told my boss and he said, no, you have to do something. But he regrets it and feels so guilty even to this day.
Yeah, I'm sure. Oh my goodness, that's awful. Also in 2020, Ahmaud Arbery was another victim of modern day lynching. He was jogging in Brunswick, Georgia. And then 3 men who claimed he was trespassing. So it was a father and son, Greg and Travis McMichael. They used a pickup truck to chase him down and they were armed with a shotgun. And then their neighbor joined them in his own truck and also recording this whole thing happening. So we have receipts.
Right.
He recorded Travis McMichael blasting Arbery with a shotgun, which then killed him. So, this poor man was just innocently jogging,
right,
accused of trespassing. So if you think somebody's trespassing, if I go look out in my backyard and somebody's jogging through my backyard and then they, sort of start to leave my backyard, am I going to jump in my car, grab a gun and start chasing that person down because they're trespassing?
Right.
Anyway,
if it were indeed about trespassing, that was just an excuse to hunt down and kill.
Yes. And so all 3 of the men were convicted of federal hate crimes this year. But again, that does fit the definition of a lynching, right? Assembled mob, no due process, taking so-called justice in their own hands and murdering someone through a torturous means. So those are just some high profile cases, but like we said, this just happens in a lot of places. There are some actual legal ways of hurting people and murdering people. And the reason why I mentioned this is because I just think it's really important for us to call out those things because we have the power as voters and as citizens to fight these unjust laws. And there are several states who have stand your ground laws, and Florida, unsurprisingly, is one of them. And this law basically allows people to armed people to kill others in the name of self-defense. So we talked about Trayvon Martin in an earlier episode, and he was a victim of a stand your ground law. And of course, and in that case, Trayvon Martin was a child who was Black, and a white person shot and killed him in cold blood, but then was able to get off in the name
in
of
broad daylight.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you for that, Dr. Alicia. And I think as an educator, I think it's important that you continue to educate us so that we can be informed in ways that people may not know if the truth in education or the truth in history is being prevented or veiled. So what I would like to contribute to the conversation is obviously the psychology of not only the lynching, but also of hate and how hate crimes and the support legislatively of hate crimes is what's allowing underlying currents of racism to continue. So first, what is a hate crime? The Anti-Lynching Act seeks to make lynching a federal hate crime. So when we define hate, looking at the Oxford Dictionary, hate as a noun is to feel intense or passionate dislike for someone. It's also as a verb to dislike somebody or something very much. Merriam-Webster, which to me, this definition I appreciate more from a psychological behavioral study of it. It shows as a noun, it's the intense hostility and aversion, usually deriving from fear, anger, or sense of injury. So when you have a perceived threats of attack for trespassing or the stand your ground laws that you were mentioning, then this hate crime may be as a result of a sense of injury to a person's property or a person's person, their body. So when we look at the psychology of hate, there are unique behavioral features such as the motivation to eliminate the object of your hate. And this revenge is often a part of hate because the idea behind the revenge is wanting to put that person or that group in a state of being hurt themselves, and as a way to have revenge or retaliation for the hurt that you feel that you have experienced. So when you look at things politically, or they took our jobs in an economic stance, or they're taking our women, if you feel as if you have lost something as a person or as your personhood, then you may feel as if you are responding out of a sense of revenge when it really is from a sense of hate. I think it's important to understand that hate spreads in and increases much quicker if it's directed at a group rather than an individual. And the reason behind that is it just takes so much energy to be hating and hateful toward a person. And we always mention about the cognitive dissonance, and you also have psychological internal conflict. So if you hate a person, it's because you think that they are so completely and wholly awful and evil and wrong and mean that you absolutely detest and have hostility toward them. If it's just that one person, it's hard to do if you then go and see them helping a little old lady going across the street, or your child fell on the ground and they helped pick the child up. So it's hard to have intense hostility. It's harder to hurt a whole person because one person always has good parts and bad parts. And when you see those good parts popping up, it makes it very uncomfortable psychologically to continue hating that person. But you can still hate that person. It just takes much more energy. So it's easier for groups of people to also hate other groups of people, because whereas you might have one particular member of group A who is doing all these bad things, and you have the other group members in that same group who are also doing bad things, if one of them every now and then you witness doing something good, it's okay to say, okay, well, that person still is doing a good thing. But in general, that whole group is still really bad. So it allows you to have a way of blatantly and putting a blanket on hatred toward a group, because you don't have to be responsible in yourself to then be accountable for seeing that, well, they did do this nice thing or they did do that nice thing. So they're not all bad. So I can't hate them. But when you want to hate a person and you want to hate a group, you will focus exclusively on the whole person or the whole group. And I think it's a good way to have a contrast between I'm angry at you or angry with you, or I have hatred toward you. And the difference is when you are angry, you're usually angry at a thing that a person did or a situation that happened. Whereas when you are hating a person or hating a group, you hate the whole existence of that person or the whole existence of that group. And for that reason, because it's easier to hate groups, this is a good bed or a festering pool for how you can have racial injustices happening, because it's easier to hate a group. And if that group is a racial group that you don't like, then, or another demographic group, then it's easier to then hate them. And this is how we have laws of injustice that we're seeing now, such as hate crimes against individual groups of people. And that's what allows these hate crimes to continue. What were you saying?
And I was just thinking, like, when you were talking through that, I mean, if you know that, like, for example, let's just talk about George Floyd. George Floyd was a custodian. He was well liked in his neighborhood. He had a family. You know, if you know these personal things about George Floyd, you're probably less inclined to want to kill him. But if you're just looking at George Floyd as a symbol of, you know,
a big black man,
then like you said, that just allows you to justify or to, you know, not think of him as a person, you know.
And he was a mama's boy. If you know someone's a mama's boy, like, how can you like actually hate him as a person? You know, he's crying out for his mom. So, you know, it's very easy to hate a group rather than a person, because then you have to then also be in your own mind, in your own psychological ego, and your monitoring of your ego and your identity of who you are as a person. You cannot then continue to justify hating one person when you then know that other things like a mama's boy or a custodian or being a nice person. So I also want to add that when you are angry is usually a very short-term experience, whereas hatred is a longer-term experience.
Yes.
And and because of this, again, this is how you have hate crimes and hate laws, such as lynching. And lynching is recognized as a hate crime. So if we look back at the whole, how hatred is allowed to continue in our lives and in our country, we also see how the lives of the people are reflected in our legislation, in our bills, as well as our laws. And for this reason, it's still legal for lynching to happen, because since the anti-lynching law was first introduced in 1900 by Representative George Henry White, who was a Black Republican from North Carolina, then since then, which is since over 122 years later, there have been over 240 times when lawmakers have tried to outlaw the lynching that's still continuing to happen. And I think that just shows that, okay, it's been over 240 times Congress came together, and it's been over 120 years, and we're still saying, no, I'm not sure about that. So that just shows that hate is a very long-term experience, and that if you can have that long and intense hostility, it will make you do things such as maintain legislation or maintain going against legislation that would help to eradicate racial injustices or hate crimes such as lynching. So again, President Warren Harding, he gave the first condemnation of lynching in a presidential address. And the House has already passed presently an anti-lynching legislation, but it's still waiting for approval in the Senate. Now we're saying it's still waiting as if, oh, they're making progress, but they haven't, because since it's happened, since it was first introduced in 1900, the 240 plus times that it's been brought and passed in the House, it has been stalled by the Senate every time. So this is not some new thing and we're making progress. This continues to be a 240 times plus. Nope, not going to happen here. So I want everyone to recognize that we're not making any progress. This is the same where we have been over 121 years ago. And
absolutely ridiculous.
Absolutely. Exactly. And the House passed its anti-lynching bill most recently on February 26, 2020, and they named it in remembrance of Emmett Till. And Emmett Till was the little Black boy who was brutally beat, and his mother wanted to have an open casket of a 14-year-old Hearst baby in 1955 because she wanted people to see how disgusting and how brutal these attacks on not men and not just on Black people, but on little boys who happen to also be Black, and how you can use so much oppressive force and brutality, as you said, Dr. Alicia, having a brutal murder to kill someone who was helpless, not only physically as a boy, but also socially as far as his rank in society as being a Black person during that time. Nonetheless, although in 2020, President Trump was still there, they were hoping to get it passed by the end or before the end of Black History Month. However, that didn't happen. And obviously, we just had another Black History Month and it still hasn't happened. So again, I want to emphasize that the person who first introduced this bill was a Black Republican from North Carolina whose name was Representative George Henry White. I guess that's a play on words. Mm-hmm. But I want to emphasize that it's not just Republicans doing this thing and Democrats doing that thing. It's people, and it's not necessarily party. So I don't want people to think that, oh, they only support this particular group. It's people who are in Congress on the right and the left, Democrats and Republicans, who are not coming together to solve the incidents and the evidence of lynching still being allowed to happen. So the measure was defeated in 1900 by white segregationists within the Democratic Party. So people might think just because there are a lot of Democratic people who are anti-racism now, it doesn't mean that that's how it always has been. So definitely know your history. And it doesn't mean that all Republicans are all anti-Black or anti-Black Lives Matter. And that's definitely not the case. So remember, it's not a party affiliation. It's more of what is the person doing within their party to help eradicate racial and social injustices such as this of the lynching. So in 1922, the anti-lynching legislation passed in the House, only to be filibustered in the Senate. And opponents that argued in this 1922 passing or attempt to pass it, guess what they argued, Dr. Alicia?
I'd love to hear this, Dr. Renee.
It's disgusting.
I'm sure.
The Democrats who were opposing it, the white segregationists in the Democratic Party who were going against the passing of the bill of anti-lynching, said that it's a reasonable deterrent for the raping of white women by Black men.
Oh my God.
And so for that reason, they chose that no, we're not going to do that because this is what's going to help keep Black men from raping our women. When in actuality, a lot of the accusations of rape were not even true. It was an excuse or a smokescreen to just commit the brutal acts that they already wanted to do. Okay. So as we continue understanding how this brings us to the present day, our nation's continued failure to reject anti-lynching laws and bills is allowed to continue because of the general public, which means us, our general lack of awareness that this is still legal, as well as still widespread politically, not only among the elected officials, but the way that it's allowed to continue to happen is because of political procedures such as the filibuster that I just mentioned, as well as other ways that they can use to block anti-lynching legislation. So again, of the over 240 plus attempts to pass anti-lynching bills every one of them was defeated or stalled out by either the adjournment of Congress, which was another tactic, or by filibuster. And it was always filibustered by the Senate. So that's very important for everyone to know. So let's just look at what happens when we see either a person witnessing lynching back then in the 1900s or bringing it up to present day, George Floyd, George Zimmerman, Freddie Gray, and the other cases that you mentioned, Dr. Alicia. So if you're a Black person and you see throughout history that your people who look like you are continually being brutally murdered without any consequence or repercussion, that causes a psychological racial trauma because it clearly communicates to you that your life does not matter, and the likelihood of you experiencing racial injustice at the very least or death at the highest is indeed very high. And for this reason, obviously, I'm African American and I have an African American son. And that's why Black mothers are being forced to tell their Black sons how to behave around the police. And this is not a lesson that mothers in other races have to pass down, but we have been taught by the killing of our Black children throughout history, through lynching and other types of brutal murders, that my child can be killed just because of his or her skin color. And Blacks are taught that neither the police or the judicial system are going to be for them, but instead we have ample evidence and historical proof that they will actually be against them instead. And this is not just a feeling or some idea. It didn't just happen one or few times, but we have at least the NAACP, as you mentioned, having at least 4,000 incidents of that happening that we know about. Well, we still also have very recent experiences. And in the case of George Floyd, despite having video footage that you can see and hear from several different angles, the majority of Black Americans knew that there was no guarantee that justice would be prevailing because of the so many other low profile and high profile cases of Black death that have happened at the hands of others, whether it's a citizen or a police. And in fact, Saturday Night Live, they did a skit on this happening with George Foreman. I'm sorry, not George Foreman. I'm always hungry when I'm doing these broadcasts, sorry, for George Floyd, when they were saying, well, you know, you have the video, and they were showing where there was a white person in a friend group of Black people, a Black couple. And the white person was saying, man, we're so happy that we're going to finally have justice. The system's going to work for all of us. We care about you. You're my friends, etc. And the Black people were like, yeah, we're not so sure about that. They're like, no, it's going to happen because you have proof. We have footage. We have testimony. They're like, no, we're not so sure. And that was just a satire, which a satire is a social comedy about social issues of the dark nature of man and society. And it was just letting people know that, no, there was no guarantee that the judgment was going to be what it was, or that there would be any guilty charges found or even filed, because we have so much proof and so much evidence of it not having happened when it comes to the life of a Black person versus a non-Black person. So this is part of the historical trauma from not only witnessing lynching from the hanging of trees, but also seeing our men, women, other family members and friends being blatantly shot down or otherwise brutally murdered just because of their skin color, and the perception that because of their skin color, they were doing something wrong or offensive to our person or personhood or to our own racial group, which goes back to the definition of hate and hatred, where you have an intense hostility toward a person or a group because you feel in some way offended in an extreme way. So again, the modern day lynching includes death by bullet, but unfortunately that's a modern, but it's also the still using of the nooses and the ropes to still kill people. And in just 2021 alone, 200 Black people were killed by police officers across the United States. And another statistic is that Black people continue to be disproportionately impacted by police violence. And as the data shows us, that although Black people make up only 13% of the United States population, Black people account for 27% of those killed by police in just the last year alone. And it's important to know the data, because when you look at just the numbers and just the facts of it, you can say, well, there seems to be a pattern here of this one group of people who doesn't even really exist in that high of a number, but yet they have a higher number of being either prosecuted unfairly or being killed. And that's the point of using that statistic. I do want to emphasize that's also the reason behind the start of Black Lives Matter, because there was so much evidence that through not prehistoric, but previous lynchings of Black persons, modern day lynchings of Black persons, that through acts of death and brutality, it was shown that Black lives do not matter, and that was being communicated. So that was the impetus behind the BLM movement. I do want to just give a little caveat and say that I am not for defunding the police. I work with police officers. I've done a lot of statewide trainings, and I believe they should be funded, but funded in a way that also does better screening of personalities that are more prone to be aggressive and to have racial thought imbalances. So I think that's something that we should consider. But it's also important for us to understand that defunding the police, in my opinion, as a professional and as a psychologist, when you're looking at police behavior, not all police are bad or do bad things. It's the personality type that's attracted to authority and authoritarian rules of regulating that are the ones who abuse their rightful power as police persons. And again, I'm against defunding it. I'm for funding in ways to create, better transformation of all systems and organizations that produce not only social good, but also social change for the good. So just want to add that in there. And I'm just providing
this. Oh, go ahead.
What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to ask if you heard the State of the Union address the other night.
Yes. I was absolutely doing.
You did live coverage on that.
Yeah. So I definitely heard it. So, in addition, what were you going to say about that though?
Oh, just President Biden's message about supporting law enforcement and,
that's right. Yes. Well, of course, yes, I heard that part. So, again, using this information about the high percentage of persons being killed by police, not only in history, but also in present day, is important because we're looking at the science and the facts, which is what we do at Provocative Conversations podcast, and to let us know that we can recognize numerical systems and numerical patterns. It can help us to also identify and unearth underlying systems of inequality and oppression that often happen when people who have power are abusing that power to either prevent anti-racial injustices or to promote racial injustices. So just wanted everyone to know that. Let's look at the psychological racial trauma as it relates to both sides, not just Black people or persons who are experiencing lynching, but let's look at it both sides. So whenever I mentioned before about hate being a very long-term experience, whereas anger is just temporary. So the same thing happens on both sides. So unfortunately, we have the Ukraine and Russia crisis happening when they are at war. And so whenever you have a generational situation where one generation experienced war and the other persons that come after that are just hearing about the war, that experience of hatred that develops can then be passed down from generation to generation. So just as Black persons experience generational racial trauma, we also have people who experience other side of it, meaning the reverse part of the discrimination. So let's look at this. Hate can spread from one generation to another. So if you are an activator of hate, and being an activator of hate is learned and passed down through generations, just as racial trauma is passed down. So for example, if you directly experience this Ukraine hostility and war, if you experience this yourself, or if you experience World War II, Vietnam, anything that you might have experienced, as you being the person who was on the receiving end of it, and you were being oppressed and abused because of it, then you may understandably develop a hatred toward the racial group of the war enemy. When you experience that, you then have families later on, and you may pass down your own war stories and experiences. And what happens is those generations after you who only heard about these war stories, they are more likely to have a very high probability to also develop hate toward that other racial group. When we look at observation studies and surveys of psychology, trauma, and war, what we are seeing and have always seen is that the amount of reported hate for persons who actually experienced the war and the reported hate for persons who did not experience it, but they only heard about the war, the level of hate was exactly the same, Dr. Alicia, for both groups. So this means that not only can hate be passed down, but hate can also be experienced from your own experience. And this is, again, how we're allowed to have 121 years passing in Congress where nothing is happening to stop the lynching or to promote the anti-lynching. Because again, it's a pass down. So on either side, when you have experience of hate, whether you are the activator of hate, your reasonings for whatever it is, the raping of white women as you believe it may happen, the stealing of resources, the stealing of jobs, that racial hatred toward that group is then communicated and passed down from your lips to other family members who are listening to you and the generations to come after you. So this is the activator of hate. As the receiving of that hate, you are then communicating your own racial injustice experience and your racial trauma, and then you are also passing that down. And so when you have both sides passing down stories and experiences of hate, it is very difficult for those two groups to then come together in love and unity and let's just love everybody, because there's been so much information passed down from a survival standpoint of how to protect ourselves or protect our resources or to just live longer, that this is true misinformation on how we can truly be better as not only racial groups, but also society as a whole. And when you look at the same thing of why lynching is still allowed to happen, is because regardless of a person's level of prestige or a level of achievement by being in Congress, they are still experiencing passed down stories of being a racial activator of hate or racial receiver of hate, and therefore having to then pass or block laws that go against whatever you are trying to protect from your own sense of racial belonging. So we look at lynching as an act of racial group hate. If it's an act of racial group hate, then that makes lynching an act of hate, which is then a hate crime. And it's because of this that we're looking to make sure that we have anti-lynching law as part of our racial justice efforts. So a hate crime, just to review, a hate crime is a crime that is committed against a person or a group of people because of bias or prejudice. Now, the legal definitions of hate crime vary differently from states to states or from the federal government. But in general and across the board, whenever we use the word hate in law, such as a hate crime law or just a hate crime period, it does not mean that it's just rage or I'm angry at a person or a general dislike toward a racial group or group in general. It means in the form of law that it's a bias towards or against people or groups with specific characteristics. So therefore, hate crimes such as lynching are not directed towards stopping people from being mean to one another or toward one particular race. It's not bullying. It's not anything that's more on a surface level. It gets to the deeper cause or the root cause of the hate existing, and that the brutality acts that result because of that are formed in the basis of the psychological experience of hate. And those behaviors manifest in intense acts of hostility and violence directed toward a specific person or a specific group of people. So, you and I are both moms. And so there was a Blacks in Wax Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. and they showed that there was an incident of not only was a lady, I hope I don't get upset talking about this, but there was there was a wax scene that they show that a Black woman was not only lynched, but she was lynched while she was pregnant. And what they did was they cut open her stomach, pulled the fetus out, put a cat inside her stomach, and then sewed the stomach back up. And they had a bet for how long would it take for the cat to get out. So if you can't recognize that as just being brutal,
terrible,
then that's the reason why we're having this conversation, because these acts still happen today when maybe you're not taking a baby out of a mother's stomach, but you're still taking those babies out of her arms because you're killing them in broad daylight. And then you have legislation that's allowed to continue that doesn't protect you or your children or your community. Sorry about that. Just seeing that whole incident just made me get upset.
I need to be sorry.
Yeah. And I guess I'm not sorry. I think I'm sorry that it's even happening, that we have to say that. So again, everyone, so the whole goal for today is to help us recognize that there are laws that exist in America, the wealthiest country in the world, the quote unquote free land in the world, but yet we still have these anti-humanity laws that exist and that are being perpetuated, and they are not being stopped because there was a lack of public awareness and there's a lack of public pressure to make legislators vote accordingly to what is good for society. So we want to leave you with our takeaways, as we always do, for provoking action now that you have been informed. And I'll let you start, Dr. Alicia.
Okay. So I just need to take a breath too, Dr. Renee.
I know.
It's hard to think about that. But it's so important for us to talk about it and to continue to talk about it. And, I appreciate you sharing those things and being vulnerable with us today.
Yes.
So one thing that I was thinking of as you talked is just, and where I come from. I come from sort of the political side of things, which is be aware of those people who are in the Senate and the House who are blocking and passing some of this anti-legislation stuff. So you can actually make your voice known through your vote, and also just making sure you know where people stand.
And also make sure you're looking at the Senate, because the House has historically been voting and passing it, but it's being blocked over 240 times only in the Senate.
There's a lot of elections coming up in November. And if you care about these issues, this is a good opportunity to go out and vote for people that will actually pass these things and prevent this kind of thing from happening.
That's right.
And in another vein, I think it's also important to basically increase awareness of leaders and groups who support racial justice. So finding out more about those groups that are in your area, getting connected to them. If there are people that are, either through community organizations or are in politics and they are speaking these messages, get behind them, get behind it, get, volunteer or figure out how you can help them. And also, I think we've talked about this before, hold them accountable. So if somebody is voted in at any level of politics and they talk about these things, but they don't do anything, then they need to be held accountable for not actually acting on those things.
That's right. And don't assume that your political party is consistently voting one way, because as we're showing in history that both Republicans and Democrats have supported lynching laws. So we need to focus on not just your political party, but what is your actual representative in your state doing to support anti-lynching.
And I mean, at all levels too. So
that's right.
The National Senate and House definitely can make huge differences, but these laws are passing in the state as well that are terrible, or maybe they're positive, but
Right.
making sure people are elected who are actually aware of these things and
Mhm.
are on the right side of these things. Which,
Speaking of
yeah,
which,
I was like, well, that's a nice shift to.
segue. Yeah.
So I actually, Dr. Renee, you and I have talked about this a lot in the podcast, and
Hmm.
then just, over the past years, but I decided to run for office again.
Yes. Congratulations. Congratulations. So,
Thank you.
everyone, you've heard her thinking, you've heard her words, you've heard our little laughing. So, you know exactly who we are as true people. So, you know who Dr. Alicia is. So, definitely go vote for Dr. Alicia. Send your money, $1 a day, whatever you can to help promote the campaign. And
And we'll,
your success, we can have good people making these decisions.
and we'll post that information on our website. And,
Okay.
I talk about Florida almost every episode because it's just, I
Yes.
can't help.
Yes,
I
you
mean, it's
do.
just like the sort of, there's just so much. So, I'm
But I
in
think
it
that's
to,
good. Yeah. We're
yeah,
not just complaining, you're actually taking action. So, very good.
yes, yes.
We're
And
walking the walk.
I encourage anybody listening, as you've listened to our podcast, and if we've said this multiple times, if you're interested in running for office, go for it. And then,
Mm-hmm.
we put in resources. I forget which episode it was, but we put some resources about running for office, but also just reach out. Dr. Renee and I
Mm-hmm.
have a ton of experience. We're happy to have a chat with you about your interest in
Definitely.
running for office.
Definitely, definitely. And also from not so much of a political standpoint, but from a personal standpoint, please understand that lynching is allowed because hate is also allowed, and it's allowed to go unchecked or evaluated. So when you're using words such as, oh, I hate this, or I just hate that person, or I hate this thing, then recognize, what are you truly saying when you use the word hate? And usually you would have to have a level of emotional intelligence to recognize that, okay, well, I'm saying this word hate, which is an emotion, which is a verb, which is also a noun. So what am I doing because of my thinking and my feeling about what I'm saying I'm hating? So if you use the word hate, I just ask you to ask yourself, what am I truly thinking or feeling when I say or when I said this? And if I'm thinking about hate, which is an intense hostility toward a person, the whole person, or toward the whole group, and for a long period of time, and I'm not just angry or frustrated, then what's triggering that? And has it been a passed down generational activation of hate, or an activation of racial trauma that you might want to explore and get assistance with? And also, from a social standpoint, remember that if you do see hate crimes, it's very important to recognize that the only reason why lynching is still happening is because the public is not jumping in to say something. The same thing happens in your communities. It's important for us to stop hate crimes from happening, because if you don't stop them from happening, you then give permission for them to not only continue, but to also escalate in intensity and in brutality. And so, definitely, if you see it, you can report it, and you can also do so anonymously. So, please be an advocate in that sense as well.
Wow, that's really good information. And like we said, we will provide you with a bunch of resources, both to the things that we used for today's podcast, the resources we use, but also other resources about, what you can do to help prevent these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited about next week's episode, Dr. Renee.
Yes, I am too. It'll be a different take on kind of like the things that we do. So I like our little different ones, like the love during COVID was kind of different and more fun. So I'm looking forward to this one as well.
Yeah, so it's Women's History Month. It started on
Mm-hmm.
March 1st, which is actually when I filed for office, because I felt like
Mm-hmm.
that's a very symbolic day to choose
Yes.
to actually put my
Yes.
hat in the ring. But what our next episode is going to be about are our personal favorite sheroes. So
Mm-hmm.
women that we love and admire and respect. And as a as a rule, Dr. Renee and I agreed that we wouldn't we would talk about somewhat famous people because
Right.
Otherwise we might both just talk about our moms or something.
Right.
So.
Right.
I love you, Mom. All right. Well, Dr. Renee, thank you so much for all of the insight that you provided today with the psychological aspects to why this exists. And I just really
thank you for helping to teach truth.
Yes, I do appreciate you, and I can't wait until our next episode.
We are your provocateurs. I'm Dr. Renee.
And I'm Dr. Alicia.
Be informed, be entertained, be provoked.
Are you going to say penis this time?
No, I'm going to try not to.
I just did it for you.
Okay, I know.